Hello and welcome to an interesting discussion on the female reproductive histology. Right. So, if you look at the female reproductive system, we basically divide it into an internal and an external. For the purpose of this video, we're going to focus mostly on the internal. We're going to look at the ovary, then the uterine tubes, the uterus itself, the cervix, and the vagina. And I'm going to end by talking about the histology of the breast. If you look at the external, that's of course going to be the labia, the majors and the minors. Then you look at the clitoris. Then you look at the mons pubis, as well as the opening of the vagina. Right. So to begin with, if you look at the ovary, right, the ovaries are going to be bilateral structures which are almond shaped, and you find them in the ovarian fossa. That is in nulliparous females. If you remember the boundaries of your ovarian fossa, superiorly the external iliac vessels, inferiorly you found the obturator vessels, then posteriorly found the internal iliac vessels, right? And the ovaries are involved in the production of gametes, right? And they also help in the production of steroid hormones. Those are basically the two major functions of our ovary. That is the production of the gametes as well as the production of the steroid hormones. And the steroid hormones that we're mostly concerned with from the physiological point of view, that's going to be estrogens and your progesterones, right? And structure-wise, remember I say the ovaries are almond-shaped, and then in terms of their dimensions, they measure 3 centimeters by 1.5 by 1, and we find them in the ovarian fossa, that is in nulliparous females. In multiparous females, they can be found in the pouch of Douglas or just displaced from the ovarian fossa, something that will lead to pain during coitus. Right. And from your gross anatomy, you'd remember that the ovaries would be attached to the lateral pelvic wall by the suspensory ligament of the ovary, and they would be attached to the uterus by the round ligament of the ovary, which of course is a remnant of the gubernaculum. Then it would be attached to the broad ligament by the mesovarium, right? That being a peritoneal fold, right? Then the ovary is going to be composed of a cortex and a medulla. If you go watch the video on the development of the genital system, we mentioned that the cortical cords are the ones that are going to form the ovary, right? And the medullary cords were going to regress and they would form a vascular stroma, which is one of the reasons why histologically, if you look at the ovary, it's going to appear with a vascular stroma in the medulla, right? Due to regression of those medullary cords and in an embryo, which of course in a male would become the testis, right? So the medulla is in a central portion, and as I said, it is composed of blood vessels as well as loose connective tissue. So it's highly vascular, right? And in the cortex, it's going to be highly cellular, right? And you find connective tissue, and that's where you have the follicles, right? And quite importantly, the ovary is covered by what we call a germinal epithelium, that is simple cuboidal epithelium, right? Not the mesothelium that we would expect. However, the term germinal epithelium in this case would be a misnomer, right? And the germinal epithelium that covers your ovary, it's actually continuous with the mesothelium that covers the mesovarium, something that you must have discussed in your gross anatomy, right? Then below that, you find a tunica albuginea, right, which is basically a dense connective tissue layer, right? So you find that tunica albuginea, which is not as thick as that in the testis, which you're going to describe with the histology of the male reproductive system, right? So that's the tunica albuginea, which then intervenes or lies between the germinal epithelium and the cortex of the ovary, right? And the ovarian follicles in our cortex, they provide a microenvironment for the developing oocytes. if you remember from your general embryology, oogenesis and fertilization, how you move from the oogonia to the primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, then of course the mature ova after fertilization. Right. Then if you look at follicular development itself, you're going to have primordial follicles, then you have the growing follicles, then you also expect to have things like the Graafian follicles, right? And what appears first are the primordial follicles. Just as a recap, you can watch a video on oogenesis, right? Those primordial follicles appear around third month of development, right? And they have a single layer of squamous follicular cells, right? Then you then go to things like your growing follicles, then the mature follicles, and the epithelium that will be covering them on the outside will actually be changing, right? Then the ovary is also subject to cancers. You also talk about cystic diseases, ovarian cysts, which can either be follicular or luteal, which are going to be quite different in terms of the diameter, right? And at ovulation, you remember, you're going to have extrusion of a secondary oocyte that is released from a Graafian follicle, right? That's basically like a summary of what really will be happening. But if you watch the video on the embryology, the general embryology on oogenesis or our development of the female genital system, it will make life quite easy for you, right? And still on the ovary, remember there's going to be the corpus luteum. I'm going to show you a picture of the corpus luteum when I put up the slide on pictures, histological pictures of the female reproductive system. So I'm not going to describe it here. I'm going to put up a picture of that corpus luteum, right? Then, of course, after you have exudation of a secondary oocyte from the ovary, it is picked up by the uterine tube, your oviduct. And remember, the oviduct is going to have basically four parts. There's the infundibulum, then there is the ampulla, there's the isthmus, which is the narrowest part, right? Then there's the intramural part, which projects into the uterus, right? And if you look at the mucosa in the uterine tube, it's highly folded, right? And it's mostly folded in the ampulla where fertilization occurs. The epithelial lining in the uterine tube, it's going to be composed of ciliated and non-ciliated cells. The ciliated cells are the lining cells which help in movement, and the non-ciliated cells, which we call the PEG cells, they are the secretory cells. And then overall, the epithelium that we have in the uterine tube, it's a simple columnar epithelium, right? And lengthwise about 10 to 12 centimeters. And the shortest parts are going to be the parts that you have on either end, laterally and medially, which is going to be the infundibulum and the intramural parts, respectively, right? So infundibulum is the funnel-shaped end at the ovarian end. Then the intramural part is the one that I said it actually projects into the uterus cavity or the uterine cavity of the uterus, right? And they both measure about 1 centimeter each, right? And the ampulla consists almost 2/3 of the whole length of the uterine tube, right? Then looking at the uterine tube, of course, I said the mucosa is highly folded. I'm going to show a classic picture of our uterine tube, and there is no submucosa in our uterine tube, right? And the outermost layer is going to be serosa, or basically peritoneum, right? And you find mesothelium and a thin layer of connective tissue right there, right? And the muscularis within our uterine tube is quite thick, right? And it's organized into an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer, right? But in other regions, they appear as 3 layers, right? Then in the lamina propria of the uterine tube, there's an abundance of elastic fibers, right? So you have elastic fibers in the lamina propria of our uterine tube, right? And the uterine tube promotes a bidirectional transport. Of course, if you look at the movement of the sperm and the ova, that's bidirectional, right? Something that you just should remember. Then third part, we move straight to the uterus, right? And basically the uterus receives the morula, right, from the uterine tube. If you go back again to your basic embryology, and in an alliparous female, if you remember the description that you have made in the gross anatomy of the uterus, it's going to measure about 7.5 centimeters in length, 5 centimeters in width, right, and about 2.5 centimeters in thickness. Right? That's going to be the uterus. It's going to have a body, it's going to have a fundus, it's going to have a cervix, right? And the walls are going to be made up of an endometrium, a myometrium, and a perimetrium, right? And lymph drainage of the uterus, if you remember from your gross anatomy, you'd say that it actually goes to four sources: external iliac nodes, internal iliac nodes. Then you also had para-aortic nodes for the fundus. Then you also mentioned the medial group of superficial inguinal nodes, which would follow the round ligament of the uterus within the inguinal canal, right? So if we look at the walls, right, the endometrium is basically the mucosa, right? Then the myometrium, myo meaning muscle, that's basically the muscle. It's very thick, right? And you actually sometimes see four muscle layers, but they are hard to clearly delineate under the light microscope because they're interwoven, right? Then the perimetrium is the one on the outside. That's the outer layer, which is the visceral peritoneal covering of the uterus, right? That perimetrium right over there, right? Then the myometrium and the endometrium, they undergo cyclic changes, right? That is monthly in preparation of implantation, right? And you remember that the endometrium would have a basal layer and a functional layer. The basal layer is the one that is the straight arteries. Then the functional layer is the one that is the spiral arteries. And our functional layer will be divided into the spongy layer and a compact layer. And that functional layer is the one that is shed off during menstruation, right? But quite importantly, if you look at the myometrium, there are very interesting facts about the myometrium in the uterus, right? And that's the thickest layer of the three, right? And it's composed of three indistinctly defined muscle borders, which I said they can also be four, and they'll actually be interwoven, right? And the middle muscle layer, it contains numerous blood vessels, and we refer to it as the stratum vasculae. Vascularis meaning blood vessels, stratum a layer, stratum vasculae, right? And that's the thickest layer. Then the smooth muscle in the inner and the outer layers, they are more or less parallel to one another, to the long axis of the uterus. But the middle layer is what we call the stratum vasculae, right? And I talked about the endometrium, and I've said that it has those two layers, and which layer will be shed, right? And the thickest part of this endometrium, right? Take a moment to pause. Which one would you think would be the thickest part? The one that is being shed off or the one that is remaining behind, right? Anyway, it is the one that is being shed off, the functional layer or your stratum functionale, whichever way you may want to call it, right? And the basal layer is the one that is retained and that has stem cells for regeneration for the functional layer, right? Then the non-ciliated cells, so the mucosa has ciliated and non-ciliated cells, that is in the uterus, just like in the uterine tube. The non-ciliated cells, the ones that are secretory, and the ones that line the tubular glands, which extend the whole thickness of the endometrium. Right? So you have tubular glands, and that's where you mostly find the non-ciliated cells. Right? Okay. Then the epithelium is a simple columnar epithelium, just like in the uterine tube. We also had a simple columnar epithelium, right? Then, of course, there's the cervix. Cervix is part of the uterus, but histologically, it differs in some aspects to the uterus. For example, the endometrium of the cervix is different from the rest of the endometrium that we find in the uterus. Right. The mucosa in the cervix, that's in the endometrium, it's made about 2 to 3 millimeters in thickness. Right. Right. And the glands that I find there are going to be large, branched cervical glands. The glands show cyclical changes and they secrete the mucus. Remember, if you remember the anatomy of the vaginal wall, you don't have glands there. The mucus in the vagina comes from the cervix, right? And the cervical mucosa nonetheless undergoes little changes and thickness during menstruation. Right? So it's not really shed off during menstruation, and you lack the spiral arteries, right? That's mainly for the endocervix. And the exocervix now, right? The exocervix is the one that is lined by a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And at that transition border between the exocervix and the endocervix, that's where cancers are actually going to be more common, right? And those mucus glands, they may be good for production of mucus that we need for lubrication and everything, right? But if you block those the openings of those glands, you form something known as the Nabothian cyst, right? And they may not be so desirable, right? Then on the pictures, I'm going to put up a picture of placenta, right? I won't really describe the placenta with this video, but you'd remember that the placenta is quite essential during embryology. It's going to start with you have a primary chorionic villi, a secondary, a tertiary, and the different parts that are actually going to be making up that primary villi, right? And the secondary and the tertiary. Of course, you start with cytotrophoblast extending into the syncytial trophoblast, that's the primary. Then the secondary, you now have invasion of extraembryonic mesoderm. Then the tertiary, you now have formation of blood vessels as you form your placental tissue, right? So interesting to discuss this if you really remember if you really appreciate your general embryology, right? And the fifth part is the vagina, which some argue it's about 8 to 9 centimeters, highly stretchable, right? Legs glands, you don't have a submucosa, right? So the inner layer is the mucosa, right? And it has transverse folds, which can also be called rugae. And the epithelium there is stratified squamous epithelium, right? Others say it's non-keratinized, but after you have you do have keratohyalin granules, but in other lower animals, it is keratinized, and keratinization really does not occur under normal circumstances in humans, but those keratohyalin granules, they accumulate after abrasion, right, during sexual intercourse, right? Then you also have a muscular layer and you have an adventitial layer on the outside, right? The muscular layer will have 2 layers, sometimes 3, but you have a circular and a longitudinal layer, right? Then the adventitial layer is the one that would be on the outside, right? Which is an outer dense connective tissue, and as well as a layer of loose connective tissue. It's actually the reverse. It's inner dense connective tissue. And on the outside, you find loose connective tissue with a bit of fat there. Then, of course, I say this video would focus mainly on the internal organs, but I won't really skip the external, but I'll just mention them. We said with the mons pubis, the labium, you have the opening and stuff like that, right? And what may be essential to remember From your grosser, I know you would have mentioned that the labial majors resemble the scrotum, and more or less they're the same. So you also find diastemass were there. You also find all those layers. Right? So if you just remember the gross anatomy of the scrotum, you'd be okay to remember the structure of the labia majors, and they're going to be devoid of hair on the inner surfaces, right? And they do have sebaceous glands and sweat glands on both the outer and the inner surfaces, right? Then the labia minora, they're also paired. There's one on the other side. On the other side, they're also hairless folds of skin. They form the borders of the vestibule, right? And they're homologous to the skin that you find on the penis. They have abundant melanin and stuff like that. Not so important to remember. And the clitoris is going to resemble the erectile tissue in the male. So you find the corpora cavernosa and that, right? And the vestibule, it's basically stratified squamous epithelium skin, and you find a few mucus glands on the outside there. Then lastly, number 6, there's the breast or the mammary glands, right? And they develop along the milk ridge, and embryologically they come from the ectoderm, and the other parts from the milk ridge are going to regress and they leave the breast tissue in one normal location, right? The modified apocrine squirt gland, which is something which you'd have described when you did the anatomy of the thoracic chest wall, when you described the breast tissue as being within your superficial fascia, with of course a small tail that extended into the retromammary space, right? The tail spans, right? Then maybe you'll also remember that from that milk ridge, you can get polymastia, where numerous breasts are going to develop anywhere along that milk ridge on the ventral body wall, right? Not so important to remember for the histological part. Then you have Cooper's ligaments or the suspensory ligaments of breast tissue, which connects it to the dermis, right? So that is also important to remember. I'm going to put up a picture shortly of breast tissue, right? Then if you look at the areola contains sebaceous glands. You also find a bit of squirt glands, and you find modified mammary glands there, known as the glands of Montgomery, right? Just interesting facts to remember about that breast tissue. Then of course, it's hormonally controlled by things like estrogens, progestogens, and stuff like that. But for the secretion and the injection of milk, from a physiology, to remember that you need prolactin and oxytocin, of course, right? Okay, right. Then I'm gonna put up the pictures now. Right. So this is ovarian tissue, right? So this right there is ovarian tissue. Right. For example, this here surrounding this follicle there, that's a zona pellucida. You have a follicle that is developing right over there, right? Then here we have an antral follicle, yeah, right? We have another follicle here with a zona pellucida there. Right. This on the outside here of the ovary, that's our germinal epithelium right over there. Then these are granulosa cells here. Those are granulosa cells. This here is an antrum. It's an antrum right over there. Then so that's the cortex. Here we're now seeing this is an early follicle. That's an early follicle right over there. This one on the other side, that's a late primary follicle. Right. You can appreciate the nucleus right over there. You can appreciate the zona pellucida on the outside here. Right. Then we can appreciate the follicular cells here. Then these are follicular cells again. These ones, those are follicular cells. This right over here, that's a follicular antrum. Right. Then these are the thicker cells. Right. we have thicker external cells here. Then these ones are thicker internal, right? Something that you must now be able to pick up from your general embryology, general histology, now histology of the female reproductive system. On my right, that again is a follicular antrum here. That's a follicular antrum there. Right? And those are granulosa cells here. Right? And still the same things from here. We have a zona pellucida right over there. Then we have an antral follicle right over there. Still the same here. Still the same here again. Right. Then, like I promised before, I'll put up a picture of the corpus luteum. This is corpus luteal tissue. Right. If you look at this picture here, on this side here, I'm sure you can now pick up what these are. Those are blood vessels, right? Then this used to be the cavity of the follicular cells. Right? This is now corpus luteal tissue. Then right over here, we have the thicker lutein cells. These ones, these regions, those where you have thicker lutein cells, right? You'd be forgiven for getting that. Then this here is now a high magnification. You can now see some connective tissue in between right over there, right? Then there's a classic picture of the uterine tube. Remember I said the folds, there you have the lumen right over there. Then this is the mucosa, highly folded, right? This is the muscularis layer here, right? Quite an interesting picture. At high magnification, you can see here, that's the epithelium or simple column epithelium. You can appreciate the folds, right? Then right. Then, and from this here, that's a high magnification of the cells. You can appreciate the pig cells in this region here. The ones that are not ciliated, and the cilia is here. So those are now the lining cells, right? Then it's a classic picture of uterine tissue, right? This right here, that's the myometrium, right? Then this is the surface epithelium on the side. Oh, these are glands in the endometrium, right? It's a classic picture. This is surface epithelium again. Here you have glands, right? That's uterus tissue. Same applies here, right? There's a blood vessels right over there. This here is there's a gland, that's a gland, that's a gland, that's a gland. That there's always endometrium. This is myometrium below here, right? This again is uterine tissue. Just a different view, right? This is still uterine tissue, but it's now the cervix, right? So this is basically the mucosa. Right? You can see the epithelium right over there. Right. You can look at the side that we now have stratified squamous epithelium. That's the exocervix, right? Then this classic picture of placental tissue. I promised to put up a picture of the placenta. This right here, that's a blood vessel within the chorionic villi, more or less a tertiary villi, right? Then you can appreciate here, right? This is the chorionic plate, right? If you remember your embryology, right? And this is the chorionic villi on the side here. Quite interesting, right? Then this right here, right? This is a blood vessel within our chorionic villi, right? Then classic picture of vaginal tissue, this one. can even see the stratified squamous epithelium here. And this is connective tissue. That's a blood vessel right over there. There again, that's a blood vessel. Right. This is smooth muscle on the outside here. Looks longitudinally arranged. Right. That's longitudinal arrangement. That's higher magnification. And this is breast tissue. Right. That's breast tissue. Can appreciate the ducts there, right, for draining. Then that's a lobular unit. Right. That's a terminal duct lobular unit. This one. Right. This is breast tissue, and funny enough, this is inactive breast tissue. It's not active. Right. Then this is active breast tissue. You can now see all these terminal duct lobular units now. This is active breast tissue. Right, and in between here, right, this is just connective tissue septa. Right. This is connective tissue septa. Right. Then this is an interlobular duct. It's in between the lobules. Right. This is methyl green osmium staining. Right. It's still showing the same picture. Right. That's just about it. Thank you for watching.